Your Steve Jones Show podcast is loading now. The Steve Jones Show podcast is sponsored by Sunbury Motors, North 4th Street in Sunbury, and Sunbury Motors Kia, routes 11 and 15 in Hummel's Wharf. Sports talk where your voice counts. This is the Steve Jones Show on News Radio 1070 WKOK. Now from the Sunbury Motors studio, here's Steve Jones.
Sunbury Motors, 4th Street in Sunbury. Sunbury Motors Kia, routes 11 and 15, Hummel's Wharf, and online at sunburymotors.com. Ford, Kia, Hyundai, the best in new inventory, all with great warranties and a fabulous pre-owned inventory with the Sunbury Motors guarantee, and a service department that for the life of the vehicle backs us all up with great technicians. It's one-stop shopping. It's Sunbury Motors, 4th Street in Sunbury. Sunbury Motors Kia, routes 11 and 15, Hummel's Wharf, and online at sunburymotors.com. Now, one quick note, Matt, before we get to Ben here. Look at what the Big 12 was able to do. They really, on two different occasions, they really have warded off extinction, and they've come out on the positive side of it. And what's interesting is they're the one that does not have a conference TV network. There is no Big 12 network. You know, they've done it with ESPN, Fox, and then they have some regional coverage as well that Phillips 66 sponsors. They got a great sponsor to go with all of this. But they've been able to keep themselves alive without doing streaming, without doing their own conference network. I give them a lot of credit for that. Give them a lot of credit. Just my point is streaming. I think for anybody, the Pac-12, I think they think like streaming is their savior. I'm not so sure, based on the money that they're losing right now, that it can be.
I totally agree. And not only that, it's kind of a pain to do, to be honest with you.
Oh, geez, I'd be watching Amazon and on Thursday nights, and the game would be bad. I'd be like, okay, well, you you got to get out of it. You got to get back into cable.
Exactly. Yeah. It's not as simple. Just flick on the TV and that's it. So yeah, I get it.
And when it comes to TV watching, I admit I'm lazy. I just want to hit the button. And I mean, come on. I'm not lazy on other things, but when it comes to that, I'm like, hey, come on, let's go. All right, time now for our play-by-play call of the day. Brandon Miller played last night. The South Carolina fans were not hospitable to him because of all the stories, and he still came up with a huge performance.
Shot clock off. Alabama will try to win it with one more here in OT. Miller guarded by Gigi, two of the most highly touted freshmen of the country this year. Miller with three. Miller to the rim. Miller with the left hand.
Was that the radio call? If it was, it would be Chris Stewart.
I couldn't really tell. I believe it was, yeah, but it was shown on ESPN last night.
Good, yeah, because Chris Stewart's I personally like Chris a lot. Good guy. Filled in this year for Eli when Eli Gold could not do games. Hey, it was great to see Ben Jones in Minneapolis on Saturday night. Ben, great to see you there. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Steve, it was great to see you too, and thanks for having me.
So he goes out and Jalen Pickett gets 32. I mean, so you're going to be the one reporter that in person saw both the performances. What did you think about the efficiency of it combined with the fact he had 15 assists last week too?
Yeah, I mean, this was sort of like, you hate to compare players to automobiles, but it's like getting a finely tuned Corvette to work on all cylinders. I thought that, the thing is I don't think that Jalen Pickett played that much differently those last two nights than he had really the entire year. You just have more shots go in. His three-pointer has been on point really the all season, but certainly the last couple weeks. And again, he does what he does so well, which is find people who are open, find people that are going to make shots for him, and they did just that. So I think it's always easy to get caught up in the scoring in games like that, and rightfully so, especially with the efficiency that he had from the field. But at the same time, it was also everything else that Jalen Pickett does so well, and that can sometimes get lost in that final number because it is so sexy, and it's hard to ignore a guy that's dropping 30 and 40 points a game. But, yeah, I mean, this was Jalen Pickett at his best, and how long can he keep it up? I guess we'll see starting tonight, but certainly it's hard to imagine that he's going to suddenly hit a wall.
I know Seth Lundy had been under the weather heading into the game, so the scoring was not there, but he had the primary responsibility of Jamison Battle. You've watched the last 2 years of Seth Lundy. What have been your thoughts, Ben, of him as a defender?
Oh, I mean, I think that he is really – I mean, people who watch the Big Ten know how good of a defender he is, but I think he is really one of the more underrated defenders in the country. And I think that, you know, for as much as we talk about Jalen Pickett, not so much as a defender, but just as an all-around player, that Seth Lundy has been outstanding night in and night out for Penn State on both ends of the floor. He gets rebounds. He has tough defensive assignments every single night, and he's been scoring the ball really efficiently. So I think, you know, for my money, Jalen Pickett deserves the spotlight. He deserves the praise. He deserves everything that's come to him because he's a great player. But I think Seth Lundy has been really just phenomenal this year. And it goes to show, you know, you go back to things we talked about earlier in the season or before the season started, you know, the fact that Seth Lundy finally has the same head coach for back-to-back years. I think it's one of those things that's finally paying dividends for him. But, yeah, just from a defensive standpoint, he's gotten better and better and has really turned into one of the premier defenders in the Big Ten and arguably in the country.
It is one thing to hear about an Andrew Funk when he's playing for Bucknell. It's another thing to see him on an everyday basis. What have been your thoughts?
I mean, I think the most fun thing about Andrew Funk is that he doesn't care where he is on the court or whether or not the heat check is necessary. He's just going to chuck it. And I think that is, you know, obviously probably oversimplifying things a little bit for him, but I think the confidence that he has as a three-point shooter, his ability to make them quickly, his ability to make them from moving off the ball, his ability to make them in transition, and his fearlessness. I think you need all of those things to be a good three-point shooter. Obviously, when you're a guy like him, you're going to be put in some spots that he's had this year where the shots haven't fallen that would have maybe changed the outcome of a couple games for Penn State. But I think on the whole, you know, you do always ask that question, can a guy come from a place like Bucknell that, you know, is a solid program in its own right? I love that building and everything about that program, but it's very different when you've got to do it in Big Ten play. And I think he's transitioned great this year. And he's one of those guys, you know, I had a chance to sit down with him a couple weeks ago. He's one of those guys that, you know, he's the other side of that transfer portal story where you go, wait, no, you were so much fun and now you're gone. You know, I think Penn State fans should enjoy him while he's around because they would have enjoyed him even more if he'd been able to stay for just a few more seasons.
Penn State is one of those teams that has a lot of guard-to-guard screens. Not a lot of teams do that. Andrew Funk's a big reason why. When you watch him take care of, quote, the dirty work, what do you think that means to their offense?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's huge, and I think, you know, there's a reason why. I don't know where the analytics necessarily have Penn State right now, but I know that they were at one point, you know, the top ball screen offense in the country, and that goes up and down as the games happen. But I think one of the things that you've got to be able to do if you're going to be a good ball screening team is set good screens, get off those screens, and make your shots off of them. And I think that, you know, I remember when John Graham, this is a very strange reference to make, but I remember when John Graham transferred to Maryland that a website there had mentioned that, you know, he sets really good screens, and it seems like a silly thing to say. But I think, you know, guys that can set screens, guys that can make shots, obviously Andrew Funk and John Graham are very different players. But, yeah, I mean, I think that if you're going to be a guy like Andrew Funk, you've got to make your shots, but you've also got to be good off the ball and when the ball's not in your hands. And I think he's done a good job of that this year as well.
Yeah, they are different players, as you mentioned. Phil Williams was before your time. Phil Williams on that 96 team. In fact, Calvin Booth was at shoot-around today when we were talking about this. Phil Williams was a, quote, great screener. Rarely scored, but was a great screener to the point where Bob Knight even pointed that out. It's an underrated part of the game. Coaches appreciate it. The guy that makes the shot appreciates it, too, as a matter of fact, along the way. There will be no Zed Key tonight or for the rest of the season. Felix Apara, in all likelihood, will be the starter in that spot this evening. What have you seen in Penn State's post defense, especially in the last couple of weeks?
I think it's getting better. I mean, I think that Michael Henn has really helped Penn State on the interior. I think Keba is growing with each and every game. He obviously still has some room to grow physically, room to grow with his basketball IQ, but I think it's getting better. I think also at the same time, Penn State has sort of embraced this is who we are. These are where we're going to give up our points. These are where we're going to try not to give up our points. I know a couple of weeks ago that, you'd asked me one of the things that you thought Penn State was sort of underrated or overlooking that fans might not be looking at, and I said their defense. I do think that, they could afford to play maybe give up a few fewer points down the stretch here, but I do think that interior defense has gotten, for what it is, better. But at the same time, everybody knows what Penn State's going to do tonight. They need 2 more three-pointers to set the program's single-season record that was set just a couple years ago, which sort of shows how the game has changed. So they're going to go out there. They're going to shoot their 3, and like Michael Shrewsbury has said all year, 3 is better than 2, but certainly at some point he'd like to get stops in the paint, and Penn State's doing a better job of that recently than it had at the beginning of the year.
Because the number inside the number on Saturday night, Ben, was the fact that Minnesota did shoot 44% in the second half. I felt in watching the game, and I know you were just a couple rows behind me, I felt that ended up being a difference maker for them in that game.
Yeah, I mean, if you're not going to make shots, it's harder to win. And I think, you see the beginning of that second half where Minnesota went. I think I called it the slowest 7-0 run on the history of basketball. It felt like just because, Penn State's missing shots that they were making in the first half. Minnesota's finally making some shots that they were missing, throughout the game. But, yeah, I mean, if you can hold guys to lower and lower percentages, you've got a better and better chance to win, and especially with this Penn State team. I think the fact that they can go ahead on people, and are they going to have their lulls? Sure, everybody does, but it's way better to be up 10-0 and have another team go on a 10-0 run on you, because that means now you're just tied. I think Penn State has done a better job, especially at Minnesota. They did a good job of weathering the storm, and frankly, basketball is not always that complicated. When Penn State's shots go in, they're really good. When they don't, they have a hard time winning, and that's true for everybody. And you saw that this past weekend. That really the difference was, are there little things here and there? Sure, but they shot it well on the road. When you shoot it well on the road, you're going to win more basketball games.
What do you think of the Big Ten? How good is it in your reality? Do you think in reality it is?
I mean, I think that it's different to look at the Big Ten in a year like this where the teams you thought were going to be really good outside of Purdue have maybe not been quite as good. Purdue has, I think people have figured out a little bit in theory what you're supposed to do against Purdue. So I think because there's not necessarily that juggernaut that or 2 or 3 or 4 that you're sort of used to year in, year out, that the Big Ten doesn't look quite as strong. I still think that there's a lot of talent in the league. There's a lot of good guard play in the league. There's a lot of good coaching in the league. So, maybe the secret to the Big Ten doing better in the postseason is just to have a kind of average-looking regular season. They've done it the other way around for a while now. So, I think the parity is always going to be there because you're always going to know what the other team's going to do. There's always going to be that institutional familiarity and the night in and night out stuff. But I think, in a weird way, the top is not as good, but the bottom is maybe better than it has been. And seeing some of these programs like Rutgers, which is, we both know that over the last 5 or 6 years has sort of perpetually been on the edge of being quite good consistently. So, if teams like Rutgers can get better, if teams like Purdue can stay the same, you're looking at a Big Ten that's going to be perfectly fine in the future. Has this been a bit of a down year? Maybe you can argue that, but at the same time, I guess the Big Ten's had strong regular seasons and weaker postseasons for a long time now, so maybe they're just going to flip the script.
Well, yeah, Ben, the way I've looked at it is, look, coaches have to coach to their personnel, so this is not a coaching knock. If I'm Steve Peichel, I've got to play that way. If I'm Greg Gard, I've got to play that way. I understand that. I just feel like this conference is played in and officiated in a phone booth. And I feel like when they get to the NCAA tournament, it's a wide world up there, 94 by 50, and the Big Ten doesn't adapt to it.
Yeah, and I think that, officiating is always that conversation that we have every year. And I do think that there are there have been moments this year where the Big Ten has not, exactly doused itself in glory on that front. There's going to be mistakes. That's part of the game. That's part of officiating. It's part of the human error. But I do think that, there's something to be said for how the league has been officiated and how that can translate into the postseason. And sometimes that works into your favor, and sometimes it doesn't. It's going to be interesting to see, in a couple weeks here, how some of these teams that we think might be pretty good in the Big Ten are able to officiate their way, so to speak, or physical their way through the actual tournament. But I suppose that's what makes good teams good, is you figure out how they're going to be, how a game's going to be called, and you play that way, and you just hope that when it's late in the fourth quarter, they don't call their first holding call on you.
Yeah, I just feel like the game is played in such a phone booth in this conference. Everything is just in tight quarters all the time. All right, and everybody else is out there with spacing and flow. That's just my observation on it. By the way, another interesting one tonight is Northwestern Illinois. I think that's a really interesting game tonight, Ben.
Yeah, Northwestern's been the story of the year for the Big Ten, and I think, Chris Collins has shown that he's the guy to keep that program sort of doing what it's wanted to do for decades and decades and practically centuries at this point. Illinois is an interesting team, too, because I know earlier in the season when you do the preseason things that I'd sort of picked them to do a bit better than the up and downs that they've had, but they've sort of at times been able to figure things out. So, yeah, that's another big game. I forget what Northwestern's at, like 10 or 11 home wins in conference play straight or whatever it is. That's going to be an interesting test for Penn State. Who would have thought that Penn State would have an opportunity to go on the road against Northwestern and pick up a marquee win? But the world is getting warmer by the year, so things are changing in all sorts of ways. And I guess Northwestern being a marquee road win is certainly one of those things.
Yeah, and the key addition is not a player on that team. It's actually an assistant coach. Chris Lowry has come in, and they play defense in a different way because of his addition. That's something to watch for. We'll talk about that next week. Ben, always a pleasure. It was great to see you out in Minneapolis on Saturday night, and thanks for doing this today.
Yep, thanks for having me, Steve. I'll talk to you soon.
That's Ben Jones, StateCollege.com. We'll come back with more in a moment on News Radio 1070 WKOK, brought to you by Sunbury Motors.
When car repairs get difficult.
Well, I just don't know.
Me neither.
We get good. Sunbury Motors. More than quality new and used cars, Sunbury Motors specializes in complicated auto repair diagnosis. They can handle intricate repairs and even complete auto body with service open Monday through Friday, 7 till 4. And Sunbury Motors has made simple repairs easy. Maintaining your vehicle is necessary. Finding the time to do it is difficult. Welcome to Sunbury Motors Quick Lane. Open 7 till 4, Monday through Friday. Just walk in or call ahead. Relax in their remodeled waiting room with Wi-Fi, beverages, and snacks. While Sunbury Motors factory trained techs take care of your oil change, tire alignments, brakes, and inspections. Quick Lane, 6:30 to 6, Monday through Friday, Saturday, 6:30 till 2. Sunbury Motors, Ford and Hyundai, North 4th Street, Sunbury. And Sunbury Motors Kia, routes 11 and 15 in Hummel's Wharf. We take the out of auto repair.
Well, Matt and I read and think on our own. What the heck? What's the complaint? I don't get it.
Of course, you and I do.
Come on. I read and think on my own. What the heck? It's a big part of this job.
Of course.
You do a lot of reading. And then the other part is like the extreme patience it takes when somebody's complaining all the time. All right, so... No, senor! No, senor! No, senor! So, by complaining to me on the show, does it like relieve the pressure at home?
It does,
like
yeah.
More of a positive bear when you get home.
Exactly, yeah. Because if I complain about this stuff to Lisa, all I would get is, huh? So it's like I can't really get it out because she doesn't understand what I'm complaining about. You do, so that fully helps me get it out. It's one thing just to get it off and just spit it out at somebody. It's another to actually have that person understand why you're upset.
Maybe I should take the same tack Lisa does. And just on the show say, huh?
Get the lingerie on the deck. Call the janitor.
Just a thought. My point about the streaming part is not that people are not cutting the cord and streaming is not a viable option. It's a viable option. There's no question about that, but it's a supplement. It can't. I think for sports, having it be your primary, we're not at that stage yet where it can be your primary. We just are not at that stage yet. And I think a lot of people thought, I'd say 5 years ago. I think about 5 years ago, I think a lot of people thought streaming would be not just the wave of the future, but I think they thought 5 years into it, which would be about now, it would be the present. And certainly there are more and more people streaming. The number of subscribers that are streaming is higher than ever. The problem that the streamers like Paramount, Peacock, Disney, what the problem they're having right now, and Peacock's NBC, right? The problem they're having right now is that they can't turn any profit out of it. And let's face it, these are businesses. At some point, it just can't be a write-off on the tax line. It can't be. All right? And you can't keep losing money over it, where they kind of look around and go, okay, is this, I'm losing X amount of billion, whether it's 1.8, 2.5, or 4. Those are the numbers that have been put out there for the streamers, right? So am I now going to bid $1 billion on a sports package when I'm already losing $1.8 billion? Am I going to garner enough subscribers to turn this thing around? Amazon bid on the NFL at $1 billion a year. That's one thing. But I'm losing, pick one, $1.8 billion a year. Am I going to then make a bid of $500 million a year on something with the idea I'm going to get the money back when so far it hasn't happened?
Sports talk where your voice counts. This is the Steve Jones Show on News Radio 1070 WKOK. Now from the Sunbury Motors Studio, here's Steve Jones.
Sunbury Motors, 4th Street in Sunbury. Sunbury Motors Kia, routes 11 and 15, Hummel's Wharf. And online at sunburymotors.com. Ford, Kia, Hyundai, great selection of new and pre-owned inventory. Terrific sales staff that is there to save you money. And a service department that is there for you with the diagnostics, the inspections, all the routine maintenance. And if you're interested in becoming one of those awesome technicians ready to serve you, they're still ready and looking for more. So make sure you stop by in person, apply online at sunburymotors.com as well. So, Steve, getting ready for Penn State and Ohio State tonight at 6 o'clock, 6:30 the tip here on WKOK. And earlier this week, Steve talked with Audrey Snyder of The Athletic on the latest on the Beaver Stadium major renovation announcement that was made earlier in the week. And this was right after Steve had just had a little bit of a FaceTime conversation with the grandkids.
So do we have Audrey here?
We have her.
Who doesn't need to hear all this nonsense from me?
You know what,
Audrey.
Steve, I was going to say, I can't follow that up. I've got nothing for you.
There we go. By the way, just so everybody knows, not only was Jalen Pickett the national player of the week, he was also, in a major shock, the Big Ten player of the week. And it looks like he didn't have to share it, which is, unusual for the Big Ten. All right, so that's a good thing. All right, Audrey, the announcement made last week, and it was not unexpected, that Penn State intends to go in the direction of renovation of Beaver Stadium, which in a lot of ways is a rebuild. What was your thought when you saw that?
Yeah, you're right, Steve. I mean, this was the expected outcome. I think that you look at it, and the thing that surprised me is looking back, I mean, the facility master plan, it's going to be 6 years next month, which makes me feel old because in some ways it feels like that was pretty recent. But again, I think fans have to remember the stadium was never part of that initial wave, that first 5-year plan. So I think fans have been waiting and waiting and waiting for something to happen with the stadium, and then Pat Kraft takes over, and there were more studies conducted, and at some point, I talked with Pat in September, and he said, like, okay, at some point we just got to have all the data and say, let's make a decision and go. And that's what we're seeing now. I mean, that's what Friday's announcement was. It was, hey, this is the definitive, here's what we're going to do, which looks like this way all the time, but it's more economical to do this renovation. And again, you're going to have to do it in phases so the team can still play there. But then what we're going to get into here in the coming months and years, we'll see again, because the timeline with this thing is still really fluid. What's the financial model look like? What are these actual upgrades? You know, how many changes? What's the timeline for the project? There's still so many unknowns with the stadium, but I think if you're a Penn State fan, you're saying, okay, at least we know now that that really small percentage chance that maybe they were going to build a new stadium, that's officially off the table.
Well, and realistically, they would still have to play there, as you said, Audrey, because let's take Northwestern, for example. Northwestern's going to do a full rebuild and have a smaller stadium, which probably fits their needs anyway. But they can go to Soldier Field and play, and they're within the proximity of their footprint. Penn State had no opportunity to do that.
Right. Yeah, I guess we won't be seeing them at the State High Field anytime soon, right?
or at the Link, or at whatever they want to call it in Pittsburgh this month. So,
yeah. Formerly Heinz Field, right?
Formerly Heinz Field. What does this do for the future of the program once they get this thing started? And what can it mean, not just now, but for the 30s and 40s of Penn State football?
Oh, for sure. I mean, it's huge. I think you look at it and you say, okay, one, it's overdue, right? This has needed to happen for a long time. Now, again, what do these upgrades look like? We'll have to see. I know one of the things that Pat Kraft had mentioned when we spoke in the fall was that widening the concourse is something that you just look at trying to get people in and out of the stands. I know the fans, they've heard the complaints about the Wi-Fi, about the bathrooms. So it's all those types of things, right? You're making it a more appealing atmosphere for everybody. But on top of that, you have to keep in mind the expanded college football playoff gives this a sense of urgency. If you were going to host a game at Beaver Stadium, which Penn State could do, and again, Penn State's one of the biggest beneficiaries of this expanded playoff field, you need to make sure that your building can withstand that it's looking its best, that you're not holding your breath hoping that it's a warm day in December and that the pipes don't freeze. I mean, there's all these things that the playoff makes this a point of emphasis now, something that you have to do. But again, you look at the upside of this. It's the moneymaker, Steve. I mean, it's the reason why people flock to Central Pennsylvania in the fall. And so the more times per year you can use this stadium for other things, and we saw it a little bit with Top Golf, but there are also different events that they can do to get the community more involved, not necessarily huge moneymakers, but things like that. I mean, it just gives it so much more use than the 6-7 times a year.
When you look at the football program right now, Audrey, they're going through winter workouts. Their fifth one is coming up on Wednesday, as a matter of fact. When you look at the makeup of this team, I thought James made the most interesting comment of all right out of the gate, which I expected him to say anyway. But the leadership component of last year's team was special, you could see from day one. How do you see that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to me, that's the big theme this spring is, you kind of took for granted forever that Sean Clifford was here, P.J. Mustipher was here, Jonathan Sutherland, Jair Brown, all those guys. I mean, that was your nucleus of the team, your leadership, four-time team captains. You have a pair of them in that group. So, yeah, who steps up? And I think the interesting thing is with Drew Aller, he's your quarterback, regardless of the fact that, he's only been on campus for a year. He has to have that vocal presence. It comes with the position, whether you like it or not. And having a chance to talk with Drew this offseason, he said, yeah, it's something that he's working on. And teammates said that they have noticed him being more vocal in workouts, and he's been trying to get the wide receivers together. But, it comes with the territory. And I thought it was really interesting this past weekend when Penn State had their Thon event over in the football building. And we had a chance to talk with Kalen King, and Kalen King said, yeah, I learned a lot from Joey Porter Jr., and one of those things was how to lead. And Kalen was really honest about that and said that's not something he's really familiar with or particularly enjoys being a leader, that twin brother Kobe was kind of their spokesman all along. But he said that's something he has to do. So I think the fact that they're so aware of it and that James is so aware of it, to me that's something that it has to happen organically between now and August.
In that regard, the specter of of Sean Clifford of being here 6 years, how helpful is it now that Aller and Prbula saw what he did and how he went about his business?
It's huge. I think so much of what we heard last year was that Sean, doesn't get enough credit for these things behind the scenes. And this is what I think we're going to see and hear more about this year. How did Sean watch film? What was he doing on Mondays and Tuesdays to prepare for the game that Saturday? Like all those little details, the fact that both of those guys were able to be sponges to him, it's invaluable. I think the live experience certainly matters a lot, and it was really good that Penn State was able to get Drew in as many games as they did. But so much of the behind-the-scenes stuff was just as important because you're looking at how do you process information quickly and, maybe what tips or tricks did he learn from Sean, or maybe things that Sean said, hey, early on in my career, I wish I would have known this, and, hey, Drew, here's how I would go about that. So there's a lot of value to that, but I do expect that at some point this season, Steve, we're going to hear more of Drew saying, oh, yeah, like this was something that Sean taught me, or I remember when Sean said this, because that's kind of, how you bridge these legacies and careers. Like these guys, they're going to be tied together for a really long time, kind of as the one era to the next.
A guy that was not here in the spring, and I think people assume he was here in the spring, was denied Dennis Sutton. Another guy, too, is Abdul Carter. Mm-hmm. I mean, two guys that were not here in the spring last year. When you had a chance to sit down with them on the media get-together, what was the thought from each of them about going through a winter workout for the first time, going through a spring practice for the first time?
The winter workouts were a little harder than they thought. They heard kind of the horror stories of it, and that, hey, it's going to be really tough. And Denai said that, this is something that mentally it pushes you. Obviously, physically it's difficult. It is what it is. But he said mentally, like, this is the time of the year where you figure out what you're made of and just how hard you can push yourself. And, I mean, these are two guys that are going to be future stars on this defense. I mean, we saw it from Abdul Carter this past year for sure. But I think Denai Dennis Sutton, you just look at him physically, Steve, and this does not look like someone who was in a high school a year ago. I mean, he's just built differently, put together differently. And again, I mean, all the experience he gained last year is going to be really critical, too, as you look at that defensive end rotation with Adisa Isaac and Chop Robinson. There's going to be plenty of opportunities for Denai Dennis Sutton. But, yeah, Abdul Carter, the thing that he said he's really working on this year is film study. He wants to become a better student of the game, and that this is something last year at this time he wasn't really able to wade into much. So you look at it now, you say, okay, you get your first winter, your first spring. He's still trying to have Manny Diaz challenge him as much as possible and wants to learn as much as he can from Manny. But a lot of that is the behind-the-scenes stuff. And that's what, another thing what this time of year is about, figuring out what works for you with your preparation and what are maybe some tendencies you can pick up on film now, whether about yourself or about your opponents. So there's a lot happening, even if it's not front and center this time of year.
A couple of years ago, there were two players that entered the transfer portal, Lamont Wade and Cam Sullivan-Brown, that then opted to come back to Penn State. Devon Townley has done that. And I know that you ended up asking Drew Shelton about, give me an under-the-radar guy. And let's face it, to me it makes sense. And the reason it makes sense to me is if you watch practice on the scout team, who was Drew Shelton going up against a lot? Devon Townley. Mm-hmm. What did he tell you about him and why he thinks he's an under-the-radar guy?
Yeah, that was one of those answers that I was not expecting to get, right? You go into this, you say, like, he pinpoints Devon Townley Jr. as somebody who stood out to him, and he said, yeah, I was excited to see him exit the portal and stay at Penn State. And I think the interesting thing with Townley to me is that this winter he's listed at 6'6", 267, and Penn State's listed him as a defensive tackle. And seeing him at the Thon event this past weekend, he looks much bigger. He looks like a defensive tackle that's growing into that position. So I think, for me, like, that position is going to be interesting because, he came here as an end but was a bigger guy, and his position has gone back and forth since he's been here. So he's one of those guys that you want to keep an eye on this spring, that you want to learn more about, because the fact that, Drew Shelton comes in here as a surprise, again, another guy who wasn't here last spring, comes in, does really well, and then says, oh, yeah, by the way, this guy was giving me fits in practice, and that guy's Devon Townley Jr. It just speaks to the depth of this program and the talent that we keep seeing more and more of this talent, Steve, but there's even more, I think, than what scratches the surface. And if you're Townley, you say, okay, you're going to come back this spring and probably see where things stand after spring ball, but give yourself, it looks like he's put himself in a really good position to push for some time right now at least.
Also, through the bowl game and then in this session that was in earlier this month, everybody got a chance to talk with both Nicholas Singleton and Katron Allen. How did they strike you?
I knew coming into it that they were men of few words, and their teammates had backed that, and they had backed that. They're guys that they're just laid back, and they do not say a ton, and that's they were the same way as recruits, so nothing has changed on that front. But Nick Singleton did seem kind of more at ease, more relaxed earlier this month when we spoke. And, the thing for them is that they get along really well. And I think you look at the culture in that room that Jaywan Snyder has built, not only the talent, there's been a ton of talent that's come through that room, but the culture of, okay, it's all right if we share carries. Like both guys are okay with that. And, to me, that's a little bit surprising, but it makes sense when you think about the next level and limiting wear and tear for these guys. But yeah, Penn State is in such a good position in that backfield, and everybody saw it last year. And I think the exciting part about it is now, and this is something that Singleton had touched on, he said, I want to catch more passes, and the coaching staff wants me to catch more passes. So they've got him doing a little bit of work with the receivers to work on his hands a little bit, work on his routes, because that's one area that he wants to work into his game a little bit more. So, again, you look at opening this offense up even more than they did last year, and it's definitely exciting. And I think you can feel the excitement around the program this time of year, which isn't something that we were able to say the last few years.
I believe the athletic directors are meeting today and tomorrow, I think, in Chicago. I know they're talking about scheduling. If they do go away from divisions and decide to go with the 3-6-6 model, your opinion, who should the three be for Penn State that are on the schedule every year?
You know what? So we ran a poll on the Athletic this week about this.
We read the poll with attribution on the show Friday.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, and you tell you what, the thing, Ohio State, Steve, that's what fans wanted in our poll. I agree. Like, to me, that's the one that, you always say, okay, who's Penn State's rival? And we all know how that discussion goes. Ohio State makes sense. The thing that surprised me was Maryland as that number 2 choice. But then the more I thought about it, regionally, yes, you get a lot of guys from Maryland, former faces, teammates from high school, you get that. The way things have been, it does soften the schedule a little bit. So I get that. I like that. The third, for me, is kind of the one that we've seen creep up here the last decade, Penn State, Iowa. The fans have been at each other the last few years. Of course, we had the big injury gate, scenario and the booing of injuries. That's only fueled this thing.
Yeah, that's the wrestling thing, right? That's what it is.
But you look at it for the football, there have been some great games between those teams. And I think if you think about it as a third, to me, that's a third program. The atmosphere at Kinnick's great. Now, selfishly, I'd like to see USC or UCLA because
me too.
Out there, Steve. But I don't know if we'll be seeing that. But yeah, it is going to be really interesting to see how they come up with the scheduling model.
You'll see it. And the reason you'll see it, maybe not every year, Audrey, you'll see because, look, they didn't go into these TV deals to have USC and UCLA not play Penn State, Michigan, and Ohio State.
Yep, you're right. No, you're right. We'll get there at some point, Steve. Just how soon, we don't know.
At some point it will be. But the idea would be that in a 4-year span, you'd play everybody. That's what the 3-6-6 model is about. What struck me was looking at the Ohio State and that part of the poll. There's no question who 1 was. But there also was no question who number 2 was for Ohio State in that poll. It was Penn State.
Yeah. And to me, it's interesting because then I think if you're Ohio State, you're like, all right, we're sick and tired of going to Beaver Stadium. We're sick and tired of being on the receiving end of the whiteout because they have been quite a bit. But there have been so many great games, and, Penn State has played them better than so many other teams, and I think that's the other, yeah, sure, fans can point to the record, I get all that, but when you dissect those games and how close they've been, and we saw it for 3 quarters again this year, I mean, this is a really nice back and forth that's been going on here. And again, you look at down the road, if you're Penn State, Ohio State's always going to be well positioned in the conversation for the playoffs, so you certainly want to ramp up your schedule to that point where you can get to the Buckeyes. And
just for the record, so the Ohio State fans know, you have not been the whiteout game here since 2018. All right, so it's a fact.
But they would have been in 2020 had it not been COVID. I think we could probably agree on that.
It was a gray out.
Yeah, a bleacher out.
Yeah, it was a gray out. I mean, it was a Battleship Gray. All right, Audrey, it's always a pleasure. You do great work as always. I for one, really enjoy it very much.
Thanks so much, Steve. I appreciate it. Take care.
And that was Audrey Snyder from earlier in the week here on the Steve Jones Show. Thanks for joining us today on the show. Steve will be back with you in a little bit for Penn State and Ohio State in Columbus. Tip-off at 6:30, coverage beginning at 6. We're back tomorrow on the Steve Jones Show with Scott Lauber at 3:35 on Philly spring training. Here on the Steve Jones Show, News Radio 1070 WKOK.